The twin-engine Cessna Citation bucked against the storm like a wounded bird, its aluminum frame groaning as Captain Marcus Holloway fought the controls. Lightning illuminated the cockpit in stuttering flashes, revealing his white knuckles gripping the yoke. The aircraft shuddered violently, and somewhere behind him, passengers screamed. Tower, Citation 779er requesting immediate emergency vectors. Holloway barked into his headset, sweat beading despite the cabin's chill. Static crackled back, nothing but white noise and the howling wind outside. The storm had swallowed their radio signals whole. First Officer Janet Morse's voice cracked with barely contained panic. "Marcus, we're losing hydraulic pressure. Primary and backup systems are failing." Her fingers danced across the instrument panel, flipping switches with increasing desperation. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in angry reds and ambers. That's when she spoke up. "Captain?" The voice came from row 8, cutting through the chaos with unsettling calm. Holloway glanced back, annoyed. A young woman couldn't be older than 25 had unbuckled her seatbelt and was standing in the aisle despite the aircraft's violent pitching. She wore civilian clothes, faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie, scuffed boots. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her brown eyes held something that made Holloway's irritation falter. Recognition, maybe, or knowledge. "Ma'am, return to your seat immediately," Morse snapped. But the woman stepped forward, gripping seat backs for balance as the Cessna lurched. "I can help," she said simply. Her voice carried an odd accent, something vaguely Eastern European, perhaps Czech. "You're in a microburst downdraft, approximately 800 feet above terrain. Your artificial horizon is giving false readings because of electromagnetic interference." Holloway stared. How could a civilian passenger possibly know that? The instruments were indeed behaving erratically, but only a trained pilot would recognize the signs of microburst wind shear. "Miss, I don't know who you think you are, but—" Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak, Czech Air Force, retired. She moved closer, her movements fluid despite the aircraft's violent motion. 16 years flying L-159 Alcas and Gripens. I've been through worse than this. Thunder crashed overhead, punctuating her words. "And right now, Captain, you're about to stall this aircraft and kill everyone aboard." The altimeter was unwinding rapidly. 3,200 feet. 2,800. The ground was rushing up to meet them through the storm's fury, and Captain Holloway realized with cold certainty that the kid from row 8 might be their only chance of survival. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating her face. In that brief moment, Holloway saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected: absolute, unshakable confidence. This wasn't some delusional passenger having a breakdown. This was a warrior who had stared death in the face before and lived to tell about it. The Cessna dropped another 100 feet, and time began running out. She stepped forward into the storm's embrace, ready to fight for their lives. The question was, would Captain Holloway let her? Outside, the mountains waited in the darkness below, jagged teeth ready to consume them all. But Zara Novak had faced worse odds in foreign skis, and she wasn't about to let this storm claim another victory. Not today. Not while she still drew breath. The altimeter continued its relentless countdown, and Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak prepared to remind the world why they had once called her Burr, the storm. Captain Holloway's training screamed at him to maintain command, to reject help from an unknown civilian. But the aircraft was dying beneath his hands, control surfaces sluggish and unresponsive. The hydraulic systems had failed completely now, leaving them with manual reversion, a pilot's nightmare in severe weather. 2,000 feet, Morse called out, her voice tight with fear. Zara moved with practiced efficiency, sliding into the jump seat behind Holloway. "Your elevator trim is jammed from the hydraulic failure. You're fighting dead weight." Her hands moved to the manual trim wheel. "I need you to push forward on the yoke when I tell you. We're going to break out of this downdraft pattern." "You can't just—" Holloway began, but another violent downdraft slammed the citation downward. 1,500 feet. The ground proximity warning system began its urgent chant. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. Captain, Zara's voice cut through the chaos with steel-edged authority. I've recovered from flat spins at 300 feet in aircraft with half the control authority of this citation. Trust me, or we all die. Your choice. Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the complete absence of doubt, made Holloway's decision for him. What do you need me to do? Push forward, now, hold it steady. Zara's hands worked the manual trim with surgical precision. Janet, kill the autopilot completely. We're going manual for the recovery. Morse's finger hovered over the disconnect switch. Are you insane? In this weather? Autopilot is fighting the wind shear, Zara explained, her voice maddeningly calm as they plummeted through 1,000 feet. It's overcorrecting and making the oscillations worse. Disconnect. Now. The autopilot disengaged with a subtle click, and suddenly Holloway could feel the aircraft's true nature, wounded but not dead. Under Zara's guidance, he eased the yoke forward, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to pull back and climb. Good, now we wait for the wind to shift. The microburst will weaken in approximately 15 seconds. How could she possibly know that? Holloway wondered, but there was no time for questions. 800 feet, 700. Then, like a switch being thrown, the downdraft released its grip. The citation's nose came up smoothly as Zara called out trim adjustments and power settings. 80% power, gentle back pressure. There, you feel that. We're climbing. 600 feet, 700, 800. The terrain warning fell silent. In the cabin behind them, passengers had stopped screaming and were now crying with relief. Holloway looked at his instruments in amazement. They were actually climbing, actually recovering from what should have been certain death. How did you know? He asked quietly. Zara's smile was barely visible in the dim cockpit lighting. In the Czech Air Force we had a saying, "Bur si nebojí bur." The storm does not fear the storm. She paused, watching the altimeter climb past 1,000 feet. I've flown through microbursts before, Captain, in much less forgiving aircraft. For the first time since the emergency began, Holloway allowed himself to breathe. The mysterious woman from Row 8, Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak, had just saved their lives with knowledge and skill that defied explanation. But as they climbed toward safer altitude, one question burned in his mind. What was a Czech Air Force pilot doing on a civilian flight to Denver? The storm raged on around them, but inside the citation's cockpit, 3 pilots worked in unexpected harmony to bring their wounded bird home. And in Row 8, an empty seat waited for a woman who was far more than she appeared to be. Tower, citation 779er declaring emergency terminated, Holloway transmitted as they broke through the storm's upper layers into clear air. Requesting vectors to Denver International. The response came back crisp and professional, and for the first time in 20 minutes, the radio worked perfectly. Zara unbuckled from the jump seat, preparing to return to her place among the passengers, but Holloway caught her arm gently. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said formally, "thank you. I don't know what would have happened if—" "You would have figured it out, Captain," she replied with quiet certainty. "Good pilots always do." But they both knew the truth. Without her intervention, citation 779er would have become a crater in the Colorado mountains. As she walked back toward Row 8, passengers looked up at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had heard her voice during the crisis, heard her calm instructions cutting through their terror. But they saw only a young woman in jeans and a hoodie, unremarkable except for her steady gaze and the way she moved, with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. Morse was running post-emergency checklists, her hand still trembling slightly. "Marcus," she whispered, "who was that?" Holloway adjusted their heading toward Denver, the city's lights now visible through the clearing sky ahead. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but I think we just met a legend." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains below, lightning illuminating the peaks where Citation 779er should have crashed. Should have, but didn't. Because sometimes, when the odds are impossible and death seems certain, the universe places exactly the right person in exactly the right seat. And sometimes, that person is a young woman who once flew combat missions over the Balkans, who earned her call sign in the crucible of aerial warfare, and who carries within her the hard-won wisdom of a warrior who has danced with death and emerged victorious. Lieutenant Colonel Zara Burr Navak settled back into row 8, pulled her hoodie up and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would disappear back into civilian anonymity, but tonight, she had reminded the sky who she really was. The approach to Denver International Airport unfolded with mechanical precision. Captain Holloway's hands were steady now on the controls, but his mind raced with questions about the woman who had materialized from row 8 like some guardian angel of aviation. The Citation descended through clear air, the storm now a dark wall behind them, illuminated by distant lightning. Denver Tower, Citation 779er on final approach, runway 28 right, Holloway transmitted. His voice carried the professional calm that years of flying had ingrained, but First Officer Morse noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he made final adjustments to the glide path. Citation 779er, cleared to land 28 right, fire and rescue standing by as requested. The tower controller's voice was routine, but Holloway knew that dozens of emergency vehicles were positioning themselves along the runway, just in case their wounded aircraft had more surprises in store. The Citation touched down with barely a whisper, main gear kissing asphalt with the gentleness of a feather settling to earth. As they rolled out, Morse began the shutdown checklist with mechanical efficiency. Engine shutdown complete. Hydraulic system safed. Battery master off. But Holloway's attention was elsewhere. Through the cockpit window, he watched airport security vehicles approaching, routine procedure after any declared emergency. Soon, Federal Aviation Administration investigators would arrive, wanting to know every detail of their near-catastrophic encounter with the microburst. They would want to interview everyone aboard, including the mysterious passenger who had saved their lives. He turned in his seat to look back at row 8. The seat was empty, completely, impossibly empty, as if its occupant had simply vanished into the recycled cabin air. Other passengers were gathering their belongings, chatting nervously about their brush with death, but the woman who had talked them through the crisis was nowhere to be seen. "Where did she go?" Morse whispered, following his gaze. They had been the first to deplane, standard procedure after an emergency landing, but somehow their savior had vanished without either of them noticing. Holloway stood and walked back through the cabin, checking every seat, even the lavatory. Nothing. No trace of Lieutenant Colonel Zara Navak except for a slight indentation in the seat cushion of 8A and a faint scent of aviation fuel, the kind that clings to pilots who have spent their lives around military aircraft. Passenger manifest check revealed the truth. Seat 8A had been listed as vacant on the flight from Phoenix to Denver. No Zara Navak, no Lieutenant Colonel, no Czech Air Force veteran. According to the airline's computer system, the woman who had saved 43 lives simply did not exist. The FAA investigators arrived within the hour, led by Senior Inspector Patricia Webb, a former Air Force pilot herself who had transitioned to accident investigation after 20 years in the cockpit. She listened to Holloway's account with professional skepticism, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about the mysterious passenger. "Captain Holloway," Webb said finally, setting down her pen, "I've reviewed the passenger manifest 3 times. There was no one assigned to seat 8A. The flight was sold out except for that single seat." "Then explain how we survived that microburst downdraft," Holloway replied, his voice tight with frustration. I've been flying for 22 years, and I'm telling you that aircraft was going down. The person in 8A, whoever she was, saved every soul on that plane." Webb's expression softened slightly. She had investigated enough accidents to know when a pilot was telling the truth, and Marcus Holloway was clearly a competent aviator with no reason to fabricate such an elaborate story. "Describe her again. Every detail you can remember." "Early 20s, maybe 25. Dark hair in a ponytail, spoke with a slight accent, Eastern European. She knew aircraft systems better than some airline pilots I've flown with." Holloway paused, remembering. "She called herself Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak, Czech Air Force, retired. Said she'd flown Alcas and Gripens." Webb's pen stopped moving across the notepad. Her face had gone pale and her hands were suddenly very still. "Captain," she said quietly, "what did you say her call sign was?" "She didn't mention a call sign during the emergency. Why? Do you know something about this woman?" Inspector Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at her notes. Finally, she looked up at Holloway with an expression he couldn't quite read, part wonder, part disbelief. "Captain, I think you may have just met a ghost." The fluorescent lights of the FAA interview room hummed overhead as Inspector Webb opened a classified file folder with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The pages inside were marked with security classifications and bore the letterhead of NATO's Allied Air Command. She slid a photograph across the metal table to Captain Holloway. The woman in the military portrait wore the blue-gray uniform of the Czech Air Force, silver wings pinned above rows of ribbons that spoke of combat service and exceptional valor. But it was the face that made Holloway's breath catch. The same steady brown eyes, the same determined jawline, the same quiet confidence that had filled Citation 779er's cockpit during their darkest moment. "Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak," Webb said softly. "Call sign Burr, Czech for Storm. One of the finest combat pilots Europe ever produced." She turned the page, revealing mission reports and commendation letters. She flew combat air patrol missions over Bosnia in the late 1990s, interdiction flights during the Kosovo conflict, and later served as a test pilot for advanced fighter variants. Holloway studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the uniformed officer with the young woman in civilian clothes who had appeared in his cabin. "This can't be the same person. The woman I met was maybe 25 years old. This photo shows someone who would have been flying combat missions 15 years ago." "Exactly." Webb's voice carried a weight that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "Because Lieutenant Colonel Zara Burr Novak died in a test flight accident over the Czech countryside on September 15, 2008. She was 26 years old." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the distant sound of aircraft engines on the taxiway outside. Holloway felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning. "That's impossible. She was there. She touched the controls. She spoke to my first officer." Webb turned another page in the file, revealing newspaper clippings in Czech with English translations attached. Her aircraft suffered catastrophic engine failure during a high-altitude test flight of a new avionics package. She managed to maintain control long enough to steer the Gripen away from a village school before the ejection seat failed. The translation was clinical, professional, but Webb's voice carried emotion as she continued. "She saved 300 children that day." The aircraft impacted in an empty field 2 kilometers from the school. Holloway stared at the accident report, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. The woman who had saved his passengers was dead, had been dead for over 15 years. "Inspector, with all due respect, this is insane. People don't just come back from the dead to prevent airline crashes." "No," Webb agreed quietly, "they don't. But sometimes, Captain, the universe has a way of placing the right person in the right place at the right moment." She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "There have been other reports over the years. Always the same pattern: aircraft in distress, impossible situation, and a mysterious passenger who appears to help. Always a woman matching Navak's description. Always someone with intimate knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency procedures. You're suggesting what, exactly? That the ghost of a Czech Air Force pilot is haunting commercial aviation. Webb's smile was thin, professional, but her eyes held something deeper, a recognition that some things in this world defied easy explanation. I'm suggesting, Captain, that you encountered something extraordinary tonight. Something that saved 43 lives when all rational probability said they should have been lost. Outside the window, Denver International's runways stretched into the darkness, marked by lines of blue and white lights that guided aircraft safely home. Somewhere out there, another storm was building, and other pilots would soon face their own moments of crisis. And perhaps, if they were very lucky, they might find help from an unexpected source. One more thing, Webb added, sliding another document across the table. Lieutenant Colonel Navak's service record shows she was awarded the Czech Republic's Medal of Merit for her actions during that final test flight. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty, placing the welfare of others above her own safety, in the finest traditions of military aviation." Holloway read the citation twice, then looked up at the inspector. "She's still doing it, isn't she? Still saving people?" Webb nodded slowly. "It would seem so, Captain, it would seem so." The debriefing concluded near midnight, but sleep would not come easily for Captain Marcus Holloway. He sat in his Denver hotel room, staring out at the airport's distant lights and trying to make sense of what had happened above the Colorado mountains. The official FAA report would cite exceptional airmanship under emergency conditions as the cause of their successful recovery. There would be no mention of Lieutenant Colonel Zara Navak or her impossible intervention from Row 8. His phone buzzed with a text from First Officer Janet Morse. "Can't sleep either. Meeting at the hotel bar." The bar was nearly empty at this hour. Just a few airline crews grabbing late dinners between flights and a businessman working on his laptop in the corner. Morse was already waiting, nursing a coffee and staring at her own phone with a troubled expression. "I've been reading about her," Morse said without preamble as Holloway sat down. "Lieutenant Colonel Navak. There are forums online, pilots sharing stories about encounters with someone matching her description, always during emergencies, always when conventional solutions have been exhausted." Holloway ordered a whiskey, his hand still slightly unsteady. "Janet, we're commercial airline pilots. We believe in checklists and procedures and mechanical systems that behave according to physical laws. We don't believe in what? Miracles. Divine intervention." Morse's laugh held no humor. "Marcus, that microburst downdraft should have killed us. The math doesn't lie. We were in an unrecoverable situation with failed hydraulics and degraded flight controls. By every law of physics and aerodynamics, Citation 779er should be scattered across a Colorado mountainside right now." She pulled up a website on her phone, showing grainy photographs and testimonial accounts from pilots around the world. "Look at this. A Lufthansa captain who swears a mysterious woman helped him land a 747 with engine failures over the North Sea. A cargo pilot in Alaska who says someone appeared in his cockpit during a whiteout blizzard and guided him to a safe landing." Always the same description: young woman, dark hair, Eastern European accent, and knowledge that defies explanation. Holloway studied the screen, recognizing the pattern even as his rational mind rejected the implications. "You think she's some kind of guardian angel for aviation?" "I think," Morse said carefully, "that Lieutenant Colonel Zara Burr Navak made a choice 15 years ago when her aircraft was failing over that Czech village. She chose to save others instead of saving herself. And I think that choice echoes forward through time, creating moments when the impossible becomes possible." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching late-night airport operations through the bar's large windows. Ground crews serviced aircraft with methodical precision, while air traffic controllers guided departing flights into the darkness beyond. "There's something else," Morse said eventually. I looked up her call sign Burr. In Czech folklore, storms are believed to carry the spirits of warriors who died protecting others. They appear during times of greatest need, when conventional help is not enough. Holloway finished his whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. "So you're saying we were saved by a folkloric warrior spirit?" "I'm saying we were saved by Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak, Czech Air Force. How that's possible is above my pay grade." Morse smiled, the first genuine smile either of them had managed since their emergency landing. "But I'll tell you one thing, Marcus. If I ever find myself in another impossible situation at 30,000 feet, I hope like hell she shows up again." Outside, another citation was taxiing for takeoff, its navigation lights blinking against the darkness. Somewhere above the sleeping city, the storm that had nearly claimed them continued its eastward march, carrying within its turbulent heart the eternal dance of wind and weather that had challenged aviators since the dawn of flight. But tonight, at least, the storm had been defeated, and somewhere in the space between heaven and earth, Lieutenant Colonel Zara Burr Novak continued her eternal patrol, watching over those who dared to slip the surly bonds of earth and touch the face of the sky. Word of the Citation 779er incident spread through aviation circles with the speed that only truly extraordinary events achieve. Within days, Captain Holloway found his voicemail filled with messages from pilots, air traffic controllers, and aviation journalists, all asking the same questions. What really happened up there? Who was the woman in row 8? The airline, predictably, wanted the story to disappear quietly. Executives worried about passenger confidence and insurance liability, preferring the sanitized version where exceptional pilot skill and modern aircraft design combined to prevent tragedy. But the flight attendants who had worked that flight began sharing their own accounts, describing the mysterious passenger who had remained impossibly calm while everyone else panicked. "She wasn't afraid," recalled senior flight attendant Maria Santos during an informal gathering at a Phoenix crew lounge. "When that storm hit and we thought we were going to die, she just sat there like she was waiting for a delayed connection. No panic, no fear, just this absolute certainty that everything would work out." Flight attendant Derek Chen nodded agreement. "I checked on her twice during the worst of it. Most passengers were crying, praying, calling loved ones. She was just sitting there with her eyes closed, completely peaceful, almost like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear." The story took on a life of its own in online aviation forums, where pilots shared increasingly elaborate theories about the identity of the mysterious passenger. Some dismissed the entire account as stress-induced hallucination. Others suggested advanced simulation training or undercover airline safety specialists. But a growing number began sharing their own encounters with unexplained assistance during critical flight situations. Captain Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran with Southwest Airlines, posted her experience on a private pilots forum. 2019, emergency landing in Phoenix after bird strike took out our left engine. As we were configuring for single-engine approach, I heard a woman's voice on the radio, not from tower, not from approach control. She gave me wind corrections that weren't showing on any of our instruments but turned out to be exactly right. Saved us from a nasty crosswind landing that could have ended badly. Similar accounts appeared almost daily. A United pilot described mysterious radio assistance during a severe turbulence encounter over the Rockies. A FedEx cargo captain swore someone had appeared in his cockpit during a hydraulic failure emergency, providing system knowledge that helped save the aircraft. Always the same pattern: young woman, Eastern European accent, uncanny knowledge of aircraft systems, and appearances that defied logical explanation. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychology professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University who specialized in aviation human factors, became fascinated by the phenomenon. What we're seeing, she explained to a gathering of aviation safety specialists, is either the most elaborate hoax in aviation history or evidence of something that challenges our understanding of consciousness and reality. Her research revealed that accounts of the mysterious pilot dated back more than a decade, with the earliest documented case occurring just months after Lieutenant Colonel Novak's fatal accident in 2008. The descriptions remained remarkably consistent across different pilots, airlines, and geographic regions. Far too consistent, Dr. Harper argued, to be coincidental or fabricated. Consider the psychological profile, she continued. These are commercial airline pilots, people selected and trained for emotional stability, rational thinking, and adherence to procedures. They're not prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, yet we have dozens of credible professionals reporting essentially identical experiences. The aviation medical community remained skeptical, attributing the reports to stress-induced hallucinations during high-workload emergency situations. But the sheer volume of similar accounts, combined with documented evidence of successful emergency landings that should have ended in disaster, made complete dismissal increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, in a small cemetery outside Prague, fresh flowers appeared regularly on Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak's grave. The caretaker, an elderly man named Pavel who had tended the grounds for 40 years, noticed the phenomenon but never saw who left the flowers. They were always the same: white roses, the traditional Czech tribute to fallen warriors, placed with military precision beside the black granite headstone that bore her name, rank, and call sign. "Burr," Pavel would whisper when he found the fresh flowers, remembering the stories his grandfather had told about warrior spirits who protected the living. In the Czech Republic, such beliefs ran deeper than Christianity or communism, connecting modern citizens to ancient traditions that understood the thin boundary between worlds. The flowers continued to appear, week after week, year after year, a silent testimony to a pilot who had never stopped flying, never stopped protecting those who shared her sky. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: retired NATO Air Marshal Geoffrey Thornton, who had commanded joint operations during the Kosovo conflict. Reading about the citation incident in an aviation trade magazine, he recognized details that made his blood run cold. Thornton had known Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak personally, had flown beside her during combat air patrol missions when multinational air forces worked together to enforce no-fly zones over the Balkans. Burr was extraordinary, Thornton told a gathering of senior NATO aviation officers during a classified briefing at Ramstein Air Base. She possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that bordered on supernatural. During one mission over Pristina, she guided a damaged American F-16 to safety through cloud cover so thick the pilot couldn't see his own wingtips. She talked him through a dead-stick landing using only radio communications and her knowledge of wind patterns. The briefing room fell silent as Thornton continued his account. What made it remarkable wasn't just her technical skill. It was her ability to remain calm under impossible pressure and communicate that calm to others. She had this gift for making desperate situations seem manageable, for finding solutions when conventional wisdom said there were none. Colonel James Mitchell, USAF, leaned forward in his chair. "Sir, are you suggesting these civilian aircraft incidents are somehow connected to Lieutenant Colonel Novak?" Thornton's weathered face showed the weight of decades spent making life-and-death decisions at 30,000 feet. "Colonel, I'm suggesting that some pilots leave an impression on aviation that transcends their physical presence. Burr died trying to save others, a village full of children who never knew how close they came to tragedy. That kind of sacrifice, it changes things." The classified discussion that followed would never appear in official records, but several participants later reported that NATO intelligence had been quietly tracking similar incidents across allied nations for over a decade. Aircraft emergencies that should have ended in catastrophe, mysterious assistance that appeared when conventional help was unavailable, and always the same description of their savior. "The pattern is global," reported intelligence analyst Captain Lisa Rodriguez. "We have documented cases from commercial aviation, military training flights, and general aviation aircraft. The common thread is always the same: critical emergency situations where normal procedures have failed, followed by the appearance of assistance that defies explanation." Back in Colorado, Captain Marcus Holloway received a phone call that would change his understanding of that night over the mountains. The caller identified herself as Anna Novikova, speaking English with the same slight accent that had cut through the chaos in his cockpit. "Captain Holloway," the voice said, "I am Lieutenant Colonel Novak's younger sister. I live now in Prague, but I have been following the news about your emergency landing. I wanted to thank you for telling her story with such respect." Holloway's hands tightened on the phone. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Your sister. The records show she died in 2008. "Yes," Anna replied quietly. "She did. But Zara always said that a pilot's duty doesn't end with death. It ends when there are no more lives to save. She believed the sky belonged to all of us, and those with the skill to navigate it safely had an obligation to help others do the same." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Anna sharing stories about her sister's childhood dreams of flight, her service record, and the village school that still held memorial services each year on the anniversary of her sacrifice. 300 children, Captain. That's how many lives she saved on her last day, but I think the number is much higher now." When the call ended, Holloway sat in his Denver apartment staring at the city lights and thinking about duty that transcends death, about warrior spirits who patrol eternal skies, and about the thin line between the possible and the miraculous that every pilot crosses each time they slip the surly bonds of Earth. The investigation into Citation 779er's emergency landing concluded 6 weeks later with a report that satisfied regulatory requirements while carefully avoiding supernatural explanations. The National Transportation Safety Board credited exceptional crew resource management and superior airmanship for the successful outcome, noting that the rapid recovery from an unrecoverable flight situation represented a textbook example of pilot skill under extreme conditions. Captain Holloway and First Officer Morse were quietly commended for their handling of the emergency, though neither pilot mentioned the mysterious assistance they had received. The passenger manifest discrepancy was attributed to a computer glitch, the kind of minor administrative error that occurs thousands of times daily in commercial aviation without attracting attention. But within the aviation community, the real story continued to spread. Pilots began referring to unexplained assistance during emergencies as getting a visit from Burr, and the phenomenon became part of aviation folklore alongside tales of gremlins and the ghost of the Lady Be Good. Flight schools started including discussions of the Novak incidents in human factors training, not as supernatural events, but as examples of how crisis situations could produce extraordinary clarity and problem-solving ability. Dr. Elizabeth Harper's research evolved into a comprehensive study of high-stress decision-making in aviation emergencies. While her published papers carefully avoided metaphysical speculation, her private notes revealed a growing conviction that consciousness and memory might operate according to principles that mainstream science had yet to discover. "What if," she wrote in a journal entry that would not be found until after her retirement, "the boundaries between minds become permeable during extreme stress? What if the knowledge and skills of those who have faced similar crises can somehow be accessed by those currently experiencing them?" Military pilots train extensively for emergency situations, developing neural pathways and response patterns that represent the accumulated wisdom of countless hours in cockpits. Could that wisdom somehow persist beyond the physical death of the pilot? The questions remained unanswered, but the incidents continued. A Qantas captain reported mysterious radio assistance during a hydraulic failure over the Pacific. A Air Canada pilot described a calm voice that guided him through a rejected takeoff procedure that prevented a runway collision. A military transport pilot swore that someone had appeared in his cockpit during a sandstorm landing in Afghanistan, providing wind readings that weren't available from any ground station. Always the same pattern, always the same description, always the same result. Aircraft and passengers safely returned to Earth when conventional wisdom said they should have been lost. In Prague, Lieutenant Colonel Zara Novak's grave continued to receive regular visitors. Not just flowers now, but small tokens from grateful aviators around the world. Pilot wings, squadron patches, pieces of aircraft aluminum formed into memorial plaques. The cemetery caretaker, Pavel, began keeping a logbook of the items left at the grave, noting their origins and the stories visitors sometimes shared. "She saves us still," wrote one entry left by a pilot from Japan. "My aircraft lost power over the mountains, and I heard her voice on the radio, guiding me to a safe landing. She is our guardian angel." Another entry from a flight attendant in Germany. "During severe turbulence, I heard someone speaking calmly to the passengers, helping them stay peaceful when I was too frightened to do my job. The voice came from nowhere, but it sounded like the descriptions others have shared." The entries filled multiple volumes over the years, creating an unofficial archive of encounters with something that defied easy categorization, but undeniably existed in the experiences of those who flew. As the 10th anniversary of the Citation 779er incident approached, Captain Marcus Holloway found himself thinking more frequently about that storm-tossed night over Colorado and the mysterious woman who had emerged from Row 8 to save their lives. He had retired from commercial aviation, but continued flying as a flight instructor, sharing his experience with new generations of pilots who would face their own moments of crisis in the years ahead. "Flying," he would tell his students, "is about more than manipulating controls and following procedures. It's about joining a community of aviators that stretches back to the Wright brothers and forward to pilots not yet born. When you're alone in the